It is related that in 1661, on the day following the death of the great Cardinal Mazarin, the various officials of the state approached their young king, Louis XIV. "To whom shall we go now for orders, Your Majesty?" "To me," answered Louis, and from that date until his death in 1715 they had no other master. Whether we accept the tale as literal fact or only as the vivid French way of visualizing a truth, we find here the central point of over 50 years of European history. The two celebrated cardinals, Richelieu and Mazarin, had by their strength and wisdom made France by far the most powerful state in Europe. Moreover, they had so reduced the authority of the French nobility, the clergy, and the courts of law as to have become practically absolute and untrammeled in their control of the entire government. Now, all this enormous power, both at home and abroad, over France and over Europe, was assumed by a young man of 23. "I am the state," said Louis at a later period of his career. He might almost have said, "I am Europe," looking as he did only to the Europe that dominated and took pleasure in itself and made life one continued glittering revel of splendor. Independent Europe that claimed the right of thinking for itself, the suffering Europe of the peasants who starved and shed their blood in helpless agony. These were against Louis almost from the beginning, and ever increasingly against him. At first the young monarch found life very bright around him. His courtiers called him the rising sun, and his ambition was to justify the title, to be what with his enormous wealth and authority was scarcely difficult the grand monarch. He rushed into causeless war and snatched provinces from his feeble neighbors, exhausted Germany and decaying Spain. He built huge fortresses along his frontiers and military roads from end to end of his domains. His court was one continuous round of splendid entertainments. He encouraged literature, or at least pensioned authors, and had them clustered around him in what Frenchmen call the Augustan age of their development. The little German princes of the Rhine, each of them practically independent ruler of a tiny state, could not of course compete with Louis or defy him, nor for a time did they attempt it. His splendor dazzled them. They were content to imitate, and each little prince became a patron of literature, or giver of entertainments, or builder of huge fortresses, absurdly disproportioned to his territory and his revenues. Germany, it has been aptly said, became a mere tail to the French kite, its leaders feebly dragging after where Louis soared. Never had the common people of Europe, or even the nobility, had less voice in their own affairs. It was an age of absolute kingly power, an age of despotism. England, which under Cromwell had bid fair to take a foremost place in Europe, sank under Charles into unimportance. Its people, wearied with tumult, desired peace more than aught else. Its king, experienced in adversity and long a homeless wanderer in France and Holland, seemed to have but one firm principle in life. Whatever happened, he did not intend, as he himself phrased it, to go on his travels again. He dreaded and hated the English Parliament, as all the Stuarts had. And like his father, he avoided calling it together. To obtain money without its aid, he accepted a pension from the French king. Thus, England also became a servitor of Louis. Its policy, so far as Charles could mold it, was France's policy. The earlier career of Louis XIV seems to have been mainly influenced by his passion for personal renown, but he had always been a serious Catholic, and in his later life, his interest in religion became a most important factor in his world. The Protestants of France had for well-nigh a century held their faith unmolested, safeguarded by that Edict of Nantes, which had been granted by Henry IV, a Catholic at least in name, and confirmed by Cardinal Richelieu, a Catholic by profession. Persuasive measures had indeed been frequently employed to win the deserters back to the ancient church, but now, under Louis's direction, a harsher course was attempted. The celebrated dragonnades quartered a wild and licentious soldiery in Protestant localities, in the homes of Protestant house owners, with special orders to make themselves offensive to their hosts. Under this grim discouragement, Protestantism seemed dying out of France, and at last, in 1685, Louis, encouraged by success, took the final step and revoked the Edict of Nantes, commanding all his subjects to accept Catholicism, while at the same time forbidding any to leave the country. Huguenots who attempted flight were seized. Many were slain. Externally at least, the reformed religion disappeared from France. For almost half a century, the European sovereigns had been waiting for Charles II of Spain to die. He was the last of his race, last of the Spanish Habsburgs, descended from the Emperor Charles V, and so infirm and feeble was he that it seemed the flickering candle of his life must puff out with each passing wind. Who should succeed him? In Mazarin's time, that crafty minister had schemed that the prize should go to France and had wedded young Louis XIV to a Spanish princess. The Austrian Habsburgs, of course, wanted the place for themselves, though to establish a common ancestry with their Spanish kin, they must turn back over a century and a half to Ferdinand and Isabella. But strong men grew old and died, while the invalid Charles still clung to his tottering throne. Louis ceased hoping to occupy it himself and claimed it for his son, then for his grandson, Philip. Not until 1700, after a reign of nearly 40 years, did Charles give up the worthless game and expire. He declared Philip his heir, and the aged Louis sent the youth to Spain with an eager boast: "Go, there are no longer any Pyrenees." That is, France and Spain were to be one, a mighty Bourbon empire. That was just what Europe, experienced in Louis's unscrupulous aggression, dared not allow. So another general alliance was formed, with William of Holland and England at its head, to drive Philip from his new throne in favor of a Habsburg. Marlborough was sent to the Rhine with a strong British army. Prince Eugene paused in fighting the Turks and joined him with Austrian and German troops. Together, they defeated the French in the celebrated Battle of Blenheim, 1704, and followed it in later years with Oudenarde and Malplaquet. Louis was beaten. France was exhausted. The Grand Monarch pleaded for peace on almost any terms. Yet his grandson remained on the Spanish throne. For one reason, the Spaniards themselves upheld him and fought for him. For another, the Allies' Austrian candidate became Emperor of Germany, and to make him ruler of Spain as well would only have been to consolidate the Habsburg power instead of that of the Bourbons. Made dubious by this balance between evils, Europe abandoned the war. So there were two Bourbon kingdoms after all, but both too exhausted to be dangerous. Louis had indeed outlived his fame. He had roused the opposition of all his neighbors and ruined France in the effort to extend her greatness. The praises and flattery of his earlier years reached him now only from the lips of a few determined courtiers. His people hated him, and in 1715 celebrated his death as a release. What his career had done was to spread over all Europe a new culture and refinement, to rouse a new splendor and recklessness among the upper classes, and to widen almost irretrievably the gap between rich and poor, between kings and commons. In the very years that parliamentary government was becoming supreme in England, absolutism established itself upon the continent.